and welcome to yet another week of class. I hope you all are well and refreshed from the little bit of a break you got last week from not having to participate in the forums. The nice thing about the fall break is that in addition to getting a little bit of reprieve in terms of the workload you have to do, it also kind of signifies that we are certainly on the downswing of things in terms of the semester, which I know that is probably something that everybody is looking forward to at this point. Not to suggest that you all aren't enjoying our class or that I'm not enjoying the class, but taking classes at an institution of higher education can be quite grueling, and so of course it's only to be expected that we look forward to the break over the holidays. Okay, so all that being said, this week and next week we are going to be talking about race, and more specifically race and ethnic inequality. So for this week's video lecture, what I'm going to spend most of my time doing is defining and explaining some concepts that will help us make better sense of the sociological perspective on racial inequality. Before we start talking about inequality, though, we need to first kind of think about what this concept of race is, because not surprisingly, sociologists tend to think of race in and of itself a little bit differently than how most people do. So I'm going to give you a definition. I don't believe this is in your textbook, so make sure you are taking note of this. Sociologists define race as a socio-historical concept used to distinguish people based on some physical characteristic. So the thing that you really need to hone in on in this definition is the idea that race is socially constructed rather than biologically derived. And that can be kind of a tough thing to wrap your mind around, and sometimes because in a lot of ways there is this biological component to race. In that definition it says that this is the concept we use to distinguish people based on some physical characteristic. But the point here is that race is not biologically derived, it's socially constructed. In America, we tend to use eye shape, skin color, and hair texture to distinguish between different racial groups, but we could just as easily use eye color or finger length or other physical characteristics to distinguish different racial groupings. And a couple of other points to consider in terms of why sociologists point to race as a social construction. One, categories, racial categories have this tendency to change across time. They're extremely fluid. If race was something that was biologically derived, then you would expect to see a little bit more consistency in those classifications. So, for example, in the early 20th century, whenever immigrants from Western and Southeastern Europe arrived to America, I'm talking about Irish, Polish, German, Italian immigrants, in many ways they were perceived of as non-white. Not non-white in the same way that blacks at this time were seen as non-white, but they still weren't subsumed fully within that racial grouping of white as they are today, or as their offspring generations subsequent to that initial immigration are classified as white. Something else to consider when thinking about race as a social construction is that these categories change across cultures. So in America, our racial classification system is far different than, for example, the racial classification system in Brazil. We have kind of one large grouping that we refer to as African American or as Black, but in in Brazil, that racial grouping is far more nuanced than as compared to our own society, to where there are categories within what we would consider the African American category based on skin color and hair texture, things of those nature. Okay, so that's kind of my spiel as in terms of why sociologists think of race as being socially constructed. Something that students tend to be quite curious about is the difference between race and ethnicity. So I'm going to give you that textbook kind of contrast right now, and then I'm going to give you a caveat after doing that. So racial classifications tend to stem from differences in phenotype, differences in physical characteristics, whereas ethnicity or ethnic groups tend to be based on cultural differences such as language, traditions, foods, things of that nature. So that's kind of the textbook definition and how to distinguish between race and ethnicity. But all that being said, again, both of these things, whether you're talking about race or ethnicity, both of these things are socially constructed. And so these textbook definitions don't always play out all too well in real life. So for example, Latinos or Hispanics are technically, by the U.S. government, considered an ethnic group. But when you ask Latinos, or when Latinos take the census every 10 years, they don't necessarily identify with that white racial grouping as others may classify them into. They very much respond that they feel like Latinos or Hispanics represent their own racial grouping separate and apart from whites. And so again, that's when you kind of see the tension between these two concepts of ethnicity and race. Okay, so those are kind of two foundational terms to have in the back of your mind as we continue to talk about race and racial inequality. Excuse me. So let's go ahead and start to talk a little bit about some of the inequality associated with race and ethnicity and how we can go about thinking about it from a sociological perspective. So first, we need to distinguish between prejudice and discrimination. And McIntyre actually does a really good job at kind of explaining the differences between these two things. A prejudice is an unjustified prejudgment. So this is a belief or a thought. Now, according to Tatum, a very well-known race scholar within the field of sociology, these preconceived judgments or opinions are a consequence of living in a racist society. And she suggests that we all have these prejudices somewhere in our belief systems. We may not be consciously, cognitively aware of them, but because we live in a racist society, they're there. We are bombarded with stereotypical images of racial groups in the media constantly. We encounter ethnic jokes from friends and families that lead to this prejudicial type thinking. We're rarely informed of the accomplishments of oppressed groups, which again results in this prejudicial way of thinking. And so as a result, we develop these negative categorizations based on different racial groups. And it's important to note that every member of our society has these prejudicial thoughts, even those who are members of the marginalized group. Even racial minorities can sometimes internalize these prejudices. And again, that's just as a result of the structure of our society. Now, the point here, before I move on, the point here is that even though we all have these prejudices within us, they become problematic when they go unexamined or when we deny that they're there in our minds. But the mere act of acknowledging that we all have these prejudices goes a long way in helping us overcome them in our interactions and in our thoughts. Tatum talks about this idea that these prejudices are very much like living in a city with smog. I'm going to try to explain her analogy as clearly as I possibly can. So she says that, you know, when you live in a city that is surrounded by smog, when you step outside your front door, you may not see the smog immediately in your face because it's everywhere. It's so pervasive and it has kind of this invisible quality to it. Yet regardless of whether or not you see it or recognize it for what it is, when you breathe, it becomes a part of who you are. Your lungs take in that smog and it affects your body, your physical being. And she compares that to these stereotypical images that we're surrounded by, these images that suggest the inferiority of people of color and conversely, the superiority of whites, that we are surrounded, that these images are so pervasive in our society that we may not always recognize them or see them for what they are, but nonetheless, we take them in. They become a part of our mindset in very unconscious type ways, and that therefore, and then they therefore affect our ways of thinking. Okay, so to contrast prejudice with discrimination, discrimination involves some type of behaviors or actions. And discrimination can stem from both individuals and institutions, and there are a variety of forms discrimination may take, or discriminatory